Okay, so my name is Christophe Legendre. I am a professor of nephrology at Université Paris Descartes in Paris, and I am the head of nephrology and transplantation at Necker Hospital in the building that was created by Jean Hamburger. And indeed, Jean Hamburger was one of the first nephrologists in France and in the world. And he got interested very early in transplantation. And indeed, in 1952, for unclear reasons, a young guy named Marius Bernard fell from a roof, and he was transported to Necker Hospital, and he was given the kidney of his mother, which at that time was really something extraordinary. And what is interesting is that the transplantation itself was a success, since everything went okay until day 17. But as he did not receive any immunosuppression, he got a rejection at day 17. He became anuric, so he was transported to the operating room. The surgeon checked the arteries, the vein, the ureter, and everything was perfect. And the biopsy was taken at that time, which is the first biopsy that is the biopsy of rejection. And indeed, we were able to dig that biopsy out of the pathology department. And it's the first biopsy showing both cellular and a humoral rejection. So we tried to do a C4D in this biopsy, and I sent the piece of the biopsy to Bob Colvin. We tried also, and it wasn't possible to do this staining because it was too thin. But it clearly shows that this is a dual rejection. So unfortunately, this gentleman died because at that time there was no dialysis. And Jean Hamburger stopped the experiment at that time, and then he think about it, how to improve things. And he had a very nice collaboration with John Merrill, who spent some time at Necker. John Merrill went back to Boston, and he made the first transplantation in non-identical twins, which was a success. And a few weeks later, Jean Hamburger team made the second one, which also was a success during, I think, 26 years. So that's interesting because, of course, they were really pioneered. And what is also interesting is to read what he wrote in 1945, at the time where nobody was, thinking about transplantation except probably the immunologist in tumor immunology. And he wrote very interesting things regarding how to preserve the kidney, how to look for some kind of compatibility between the donor and the recipient, which of course at that time was really revolutionary. And then after this first transplantation, he developed a program in Paris where about 100 transplantations with living donor were performed. And again, he set up the follow-up. He decided to make biopsies in these patients, and he described recurrence on the disease on the graft. And he wrote some things about what we call now chronic allograft destruction, which is perfectly up to date, saying that in this biopsy we saw tubular atrophy, interstitial fibrosis, and this doesn't lead to degradation of the function in some patients, which is exactly what we see. And he also described the cells that were present in the biopsy. And when we read very carefully the first paper, which is very clever, he said that maybe the first recipients had developed antibodies against the donor. And he checked in the peripheral blood, and he looked at gamma globulin, and indeed the level of gamma globulin was very high in these patients. And he said that maybe that was the explanation of rejection. So it was really a pioneer that probably wasn't recognized enough because he was publishing the first paper in French, and of course nobody, or at least few people, read that expertise. But And a few years later, he created it at Necker Hospital, what was called in French the Kidney Palace. It was 8-level flat, only devoted to kidney. So one part was nephrology, the other part was urology, and there were 2 levels devoted to research. And he wanted to make people doing research and clinicians working together, which at that time was not always performed. And he created also in France the first ICU devoted to metabolic diseases. So I think he was really what's called a pioneer